Nobody, and I mean nobody, is to breathe a word of this to anybody, Nielsen said, pausing to look each of his men in the eye. Not your wives, not your priest, not your fishing buddy, nobody. Not even anybody else in the department. If the person wasn't on the scene last night, they are not to be told a damn thing, am I clear? There was a low murmur of assents. Prather sat at the table, staring stonily outside. Prather? The sullen eyes that lifted to his head, Nielsen biting back a snarl. I heard you well enough. Anybody talks about this, I'll find out. Until we figure out just what is going on, we keep this quiet. I know what's going on. A woman's dead and she was found on Riley's land. He had to have something to do with it, Prather snapped. And if he did, we'll figure it out. But for now, nobody talks. Now all of you go, get some sleep. It was Saturday and most of them weren't even supposed to be on duty today. Nielsen wouldn't be sleeping anytime soon. He'd gotten a message from Riley, the man would be arriving in Lexington in 2 hours and Nielsen would be meeting him. He wasn't going to have any more fuck-ups happen on this. Law had seen dead bodies, in person, not viewed on a computer, pictures, but actually in person. Twice. He'd even been to an autopsy once. It wasn't an experience he ever wanted to repeat. Ever. But he'd rather look at those bodies in the flesh than at the digital stills of what had been done to this woman. Bile churned in his throat, threatened to boil up, choke him, explode out of him as he reached up and touched the tip of one finger to one particular image. She had a butterfly tattoo on the back of her right shoulder. It was a pretty, flighty little thing, so lively, so full of life. For some reason, seeing it on her lifeless body made his throat ache. You ever seen her before? Swallowing around the knot, Law said gruffly, I don't think so. It was hard to be sure, though. Her face was so battered, so bruised and broken. Shit, what kind of person does it take to do this to another? He muttered, more to himself than the sheriff. That's what I plan to find out. Nielsen's voice held no emotion, but when Law glanced up, for just a second, there was a flicker in the other man's eyes. So, you don't know her? I can't be sure, but I don't think I know her. It's hard to say, though. Whoever did this, he beat the hell out of her. Looking up, he said quietly, do you know who she is? We're looking into that, Nielsen said. He placed another photo before Law. What about this, you recognize it? Law scowled and cocked his head.
Yeah.
That's my workshop. Your workshop?
Yeah.
He grimaced. I had this idea I was going to start fiddling around with woodwork or something. I dunno. I had a building off the main house, was mostly just used as a shed type of thing. Kept pool chemicals in there, lawn mower, that sort of junk. Converted half of it to a workshop but never really got around to using it much. Why not? It looks like you invested some money in it. He had. But then he got bored with the idea. Plus, it had aggravated his wrists. Rotating his right wrist absently, he glanced up and said, I ended up not liking it as much as I thought.
Yeah.
I invested the money, but I wasn't thrilled with it once I started messing with it. So I stopped. I do that a lot. He looked back at the picture of his wood shop, a muscle twitching in his jaw. You found her in there, didn't you? Long moments passed before Nielsen finally admitted, yes. Yes, she was found there. God. Law closed his eyes and leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. Hope. He'd left hope there. Alone. She was already so battered. Was she killed there? He asked gruffly. I can't tell you that. Law's temper snapped. Swiping out with his arm, he sent the pictures flying across the room. Don't give me that shit, he snarled, surging to his feet and driving his hands down on the table. I left one of my best friends in that house, alone, and a woman turns up dead a few 100 feet away from her. Did somebody kill that woman on my property? Do you have reason to think Miss Carson might be in danger? Nielsen asked mildly. Oh, fuck.
Yeah.
Do I have reason? But you didn't answer me. Was she killed in my workshop? Nielsen opened his mouth and then abruptly he stopped, sighed. Okay, let's try it this way. I can't give you all the answers you want. Ed O'Reilly. Law blinked. Then he slumped in the chair and rubbed his hands over his eyes. Nielsen chuckled. Relax. I don't plan on plastering it on the front page of the Daily. Although it would make great copy, I imagine. But I've known what you do for a few years and I haven't mentioned it yet. Don't see any point why that needs to change now. A few years? Law repeated, narrowing his eyes. I like knowing what's going on around my town, Nielsen said, simply. So here's the deal. You're an imaginative guy, a smart one, and you know a bit more about typical police procedure than the average Joe. You understand I can't tell you everything, you know that. And you also know the more information I have, the quicker I can figure out what's going on. So, if you'll tell me what you can, I'll answer what I can. I'm not answering Jack's hit unless you tell me whether she was killed on my property, Law said. He had to know. Had to, hell, he was going to raze that workshop to the ground anyway. But if some psycho had killed a woman in there, fuck, how could he tell Hope? He'd brought her here so she could feel safer, start to heal. Okay. Nielsen's eyes held his. You understand nothing I tell you leaves this room. I know you're good friends with Lena Riddle, and you're probably on a friendly basis with Ezra King. But you tell nobody. I need to know, for me, Law snapped. Besides, King was out there. I bet he probably has an idea whether she was killed there or not, and if you don't give me an answer, I'll go ask him, and I just might do it in public where anybody can hear. He's not too fond of at least one of your boys, Sheriff. Chances are, if I play it right, I can ask in front of Prather and I can do it in a way that Ezra will answer me just to piss Prather off, and you know it. You can be a prick, Nielsen said. Then he sighed. No. I don't think she was killed there. I can't be sure, but my gut says she was killed elsewhere, then placed there. It made it a little easier to think about going back to the home he loved. A little. Not a lot. Hope stroked a hand down Puck's back, taking comfort in the warm, solid feel of him. He didn't seem to mind her touch, but she didn't think he was overly thrilled with it either. It was weird the way he changed after Lena had put his harness on. He'd scampered and played around the house like any normal dog, although he'd stayed very, very close to his mistress, but the minute that harness went on, the dog was all business. Something drifted through her mind and she said abruptly, I'm not supposed to be petting him, am I? Lena smiled at Hope over her shoulder. Normally. I'd say no. A stern look crossed her face and she said, and he knows it, too. When he's got the leash on, he's working. But the the four of us, Puck included, have had a shitty 24 hours. Just don't do it outside the car. He likes to test things, especially in new environments, around new people. Just to see how much he can get away with. Hope pulled her hand back into her lap, and Puck shifted his big, brown eyes in her direction, giving her a sad doggy stare. Maybe he liked the petting more than she'd realized. Still, if she wasn't supposed to be petting him, she wasn't going to. "Don't give me that look," she said, keeping her voice low. "You're on the clock." In the front seat, Ezra smiled a little. She was more at ease around the dog than anybody else, he'd noticed. "Think Law's done with Nielsen yet?" Lena asked softly. He shrugged. "Probably. Nielsen doesn't think he did it, this is just procedure, but he's got to cover all the bases anyway." He hesitated for a minute and then said, "I want to have something to eat in town." Lena grimaced and touched a hand to her belly. "Ezra, I can't eat." "I can't." "I'm not hungry," Hope said. Ezra glanced at her in the rearview mirror and she looked away. "But I don't mind drinking some coffee or something." He focused on the road and said, "I'm not hungry either. But I still want us to sit down somewhere with Law. Someplace public." Something in his voice must have caught Lena's attention. "Why?" she asked. She had her shaded lenses on and he couldn't very well study her face while he was driving, but he didn't have to see her face to know she was probably looking at him with suspicion in her eyes. Smiling a little, he shrugged. "I know small-town semantics. Whoever did this is probably just waiting around to see what happens. And that somebody is probably going to be shocked as hell when Law walks out of that sheriff's station, free and clear." Lena nibbled on her lower lip. "Won't it be hard to tell if anybody is paying special attention?" Hope asked, her voice nervous and soft. "I mean, this is small town, USA, and Law, well, this is going to sound weird, but I get the feeling that the people around here seem to think Law is half off his rocker anyway. And a dead girl was found at his place, everybody is going to be looking at him." A grim smile curled Ezra's mouth. "I don't think everybody knows a dead girl was found at his place. Matter of fact, I know not everybody knows. Nielsen was keeping that very, very quiet until he talked to Law. The cat will probably be out of the bag by later today, but for now, there was silence for a few minutes, nothing but the sound of the car speeding along the winding country road. Then Lena broke the silence. "A lot of the people around here do think Law is a little weird, some people think he's into drugs, and there are 100 stories to explain how he has the money to afford the place he built, even though he never leaves it for work. He has a solid alibi, right? But still, there are going to be people grumbling." She leaned her head against the back of the seat and sighed. "Poor Law. Nobody who knows him could really think he'd kill somebody," Hope said. For once, that uncertainty wasn't in her voice. There was a thin, unyielding layer of strength there that brought a faint smile to Ezra's lips. He could tell by looking at her she'd been through hell. But she hadn't broken, and if what brought that steel to her voice was the defense of a friend, he had to admire that. "Plenty of people here don't know Law." Lena grimaced. "He prefers it that way. Hell, some of the rumors amuse him, I bet he probably feeds half of them, even though he denies it when I ask him about it." "The rumors that come out of this won't amuse him," Ezra said. "No. You're right." Her scowl darkened, anger bringing a flush to her face. "I'm damn well not amused right now." He reached out and caught her hand, twining his fingers with hers. As they finished the drive into town, she stroked her thumb along the back of his hand. They were in one hell of a mess, he knew. And everything in him was on edge, alert. It was somehow connected to Lena. Nothing would happen to her. Nothing could. Amazing how somebody he'd known such a short time could already be so necessary to his life. Friends. He smiled a little. Hell, what had he been thinking? Law Riley wasn't under arrest. How in the fuck had this happened? Not under arrest. A woman's body found on his property. Turning away from the municipal building, he started to walk. Couldn't linger. Couldn't have anybody notice him acting weird. Well, weirder than normal. He took a few minutes to duck inside the bookstore, picking up a cup of coffee, a few books he'd ordered in. On the inside, he twitched with nerves, but on the outside, he was calm, collected, carrying on a conversation with Ong as he perused the shelves. She was a fount of information. Not a gossip like some, but she knew things. Heard things. As he picked up a paperback, she glanced across the street and said, "Something weird is going on." Huh? Giving her a vaguely confused look, he glanced up. "I'm not sure what, but Nielsen doesn't go in on Saturdays unless there's something major and there are more deputies hanging around than normal." She pursed her lips and shook her head. Something weird. Weird was right. So far, he hadn't heard a damn thing about his girl or Riley. Somebody should be talking. People talked in a small town and they talked a lot. This sort of thing should have people talking up a virtual storm. But nobody was. It was like nothing had happened, like nobody knew a damn thing. Almost like she hadn't been discovered. He wasn't stupid enough to have lingered, he knew better than that. But they did know, the police had discovered the body. For some reason, they were just keeping it quiet. Keeping a lot of things quiet. Disgusted, he thought about all the trouble he'd gone to, all the plans he'd made. All for nothing. Law Riley was walking around a free man. Pretending to read, he watched as Law headed across the street. An unfamiliar dove-gray car, fancy as hell, pulled into a parking spot just a little down from the bookstore and he watched as the doors opened. He didn't recognize the car, but he recognized the gleaming, dark red of Lena's hair just fine. And the cop. There was a woman with them, unknown, no. He did know her. Or at least he'd seen her. The little mouse from the other day, her long hair pulled into a ponytail. She wore a t-shirt that swallowed her skinny body and worn, faded jeans. She was the last one out of the car, but the first one to reach Law Riley, running toward him, and as she drew near, the man's arms opened to enfold her. So, the little mouse wasn't just passing through town? Law pressed his lips to Hope's forehead and then raised his head and stared into her pale green eyes. She opened her mouth and he snapped, "If you say you're sorry one more time, I'm going to get mad." "I'm so..." Okay. Hope, it's not your fault, none of this. So quit apologizing. He tugged on her ponytail, like he had done 1,000 times in their youth. "I feel like I'm just supposed to say something," she mumbled. He sighed.
Yeah.
"But there's not much to say." He glanced up, looked from Lena to Ezra. "Thank you. Under normal circumstances, I'd tell you I'd deck you if you ever drag me out of bed at 1 a.m. again, but these are pretty abnormal circumstances," Ezra said, his smile humorless. Then he glanced at Hope. Although nothing showed in his eyes, Law could tell, the cop got it. He understood. Besides, you had good reason. Lena reached out a hand and out of habit, Law caught it. She squeezed his fingers and said, "Was he able to tell you anything?"
Yeah.
Just a little bit more than nothing. He wanted to go home. Shower. He felt dirty, inside and out. Can we get out of here? Well, Lena licked her lips and turned her face to Ezra's. I want to hang around town a while. Seeing the way Law's face tightened, Ezra lifted a hand. Then he dipped his head and murmured in Lena's ear, "Can you give me a minute? I need to talk to Law without hope. I don't want to freak her out any more than she already is." She turned her face to his, touched her lips to his. "I'll buy that. But you better not be doing this out of some weird desire to coddle me." Ezra chuckled. "If I tried to coddle you, I think you might decide to shave me bald while I slept." "Oh, now there's an idea." She smoothed a hand up his neck and then pushed her fingers through his hair. "I don't think I'd do a tidy job, either. Hope, why don't we head down to the Grapevine? It's a little coffee and dessert cafe on the other side of the square. I don't want much in the way of food, but I could use an iced latte or something." As they walked off, Ezra jerked his head toward Law and they started to walk as well, following the same path as the women, but slower. "Nobody knows what happened at your place yet," he said, keeping his voice low. He slid a pair of sunglasses down over his eyes, even though the day was overcast. "Nielsen didn't want anybody knowing until he'd spoken with you, especially since it looked like it was done to frame you. And a shitty frame, I've gotta say. So nobody but the sheriff, his boys, and us know." "And the man who killed her," Law said, his voice harsh. "Yes. And chances are, that guy is expecting to hear that you're in jail. He's probably expecting to hear all sorts of wailing, gnashing of teeth, wringing of hands." "You can't hear people wringing their hands." Law kicked at a pebble on the ground, watched as it skipped along the surface. "You get the point. He's expecting certain reactions, and I bet anything he's here waiting. Just waiting and watching." Law slid Ezra a sidelong glance. "And you want to parade me around like a monkey in a tuxedo, see if you can see who's watching? You're a quick study." He went to say something else, but a kid crashed into him, a surly kid with angry eyes, a cigarette jutting out of his mouth, and all sorts of attitude hanging from him. Without bothering to apologize, the kid shoved off Ezra and turned to glare over his shoulder. "I said no fucking way." Ezra glanced up and found the object of the kid's ire. It was the lawyer from the sheriff's office. Jennings. Remy Jennings, Lena's ex-boyfriend. And I said, "Yes, fucking way, Brody," and as luck would have it, Remy gave Ezra a narrow glance. "Ezra King, correct?"
"Yeah."
"But I'm a little busy. This won't take much time." A thin smile curled his lips. "This boy is Brody. I believe he did some damage to your property a couple weeks ago. I meant to drag his sorry butt over there to help with the cleanup, but I've had my hands full with a case. It's probably a little bit late, but have you already finished cleaning up the mess he made?" "Actually, no. Haven't even started." Ezra crossed his hands over his chest, studying the sullen boy's face, although he made sure he could still see Lena and Hope. Law was doing the same thing, he noticed. Watching the women. Glancing back at Brody, he asked, "How old are you, kid?" 14. Huh. Shooting out a hand, he plucked the cigarette from Brody's mouth and dropped it on the ground, grinding it under his foot before the boy had even processed what he'd done. "You're underage. You fucking asshole."
"Yeah."
Looking back at Remy, he waited. "Brody's going to come help with the cleanup." "No, I ain't. Because if he doesn't, I'm going to make sure that complaint gets drawn up, I'll make sure it gets signed, and I'll personally deliver it to my brother," Remy said, continuing on as if Brody hadn't spoken. Aggravated and only listening with half an ear, Ezra tracked Lena and Hope's progress around the square. Behind the shield of his sunglasses, he was able to watch, without looking like he was watching, a skill picked up during years on the force. Will that work? Ezra glanced at the skinny kid, let his brain catch up with the conversation. Right now, my hands are a little too full to worry about dealing with the damage he did. I understand that easy enough. However, he either needs to pay for the damage or fix it himself. Remy cocked a brow. Personally, I think it would do him a world of good to fix it himself. Personally speaking, Ezra agreed with the lawyer. But he didn't have time to deal with a pissed-off teenager, even if the kid was going through a bad spot. The skin along the back of his spine started to crawl and he shifted his glance, focused his eyes once more on Lena and Hope. They'd stopped dead on the sidewalk. Puck was standing stiff-legged next to Lena, and although it was too far away to be sure, it looked like the dog's hackles were up. A chill went down Ezra's spine. The dog was protective, but well-behaved. Protective as hell, but he was an easygoing companion. He had to be. He watched as Lena tugged on the dog's leash, but Puck wouldn't budge. Law.
Yeah.
I see it. You ever see him do that? No, Remy glanced behind, his eyes following the direction of their gaze, curious. The lawyer was sharp, pinpointed what they were looking at too damn quickly. But Ezra didn't wait long enough for him to ask any questions. Glancing at the kid, then at Remy, he said, "Once I'm ready to get to work on the yard, I'll try to remember to call. But he'll work, and when I say work, I mean he'll work his sorry butt into the ground." Then he and Law started forward. Puck's body was all but vibrating under her hand. He was growling, too, a low, warning growl that would have terrified her if she had been on the receiving end of that growl. "We need to head back to the guys," Lena said softly, trying not to let her unease show in her voice. Squeezing Hope's arm, she started to turn around, even though she had a bad feeling about giving her back to anybody. She wasn't going to keep standing there, either. A target, shit. That's what she felt like. A damn target. Lena didn't do vulnerable. She'd worked too damned hard to build a life on her own, and she was proud of the fact that she'd done just that. Vulnerable implied a weakness. But just then? She felt vulnerable, like a rabbit out in an exposed field, just waiting for a hawk to swoop down. Eyes, she could almost feel them crawling all over her. "What's wrong?" Hope asked, her voice quiet, just the slightest bit shaky. "Puck." Now that they were moving away, the dog was willing to move. But for a few minutes there, he hadn't been willing to go forward, and he hadn't let her move either. His body had stiffened and he had stood there, growling in his throat, a low, threatening growl. It wasn't directed at her, she knew that. He'd seen something, someone. "Come on, boy," she said, guiding him around as they started down the street. He came along easily, his big body a solid weight at her side, pressing close as though to remind her he wasn't about to let her change her mind, or her direction. "What's wrong with him?" Lena turned her face toward Hope, unsure what to say. She licked her lips and finally just murmured, "I'm not really sure." She could still feel it, the weight of somebody's gaze drilling into her back. Something, or somebody, back there bothers him. He doesn't want me near whoever it was. She felt Hope's intention and she tightened her grip. "Don't look back. Whoever it is. Don't look back. There's a good chance they won't pay much attention to me, liar, or Puck, but don't let anybody see you looking for them." She lied. She knew she lied. Whoever had been watching her was paying way too much attention to her. But that person wouldn't see her as a threat. It wasn't like Lena could pick somebody out of a lineup. No, he might be watching Lena with burning interest, but he also would have seen Hope, and if he thought Hope might have seen him. Shit, she whispered. Her stomach was jumping, nodding with fear. What in the hell was going on? She heard Hope swallow, heard the unsteadiness in the other woman's voice as she said, I see Law and Ezra. They are heading our way, fast. Law looks pissed. Ezra, he's got his cop face on. Then he's pissed, too. Lena didn't even have to see him to know that. Odd, how she could so easily peg him, how well she already knew him. The men were in front of them 20 seconds later. She all but felt the force of Ezra's personality beating at her, the heat of him, his concern, everything that made him who he was. His hands cupped her face, arched it up to meet his. To all the world, it might have looked like a lover's kiss, and it was. But nobody other than Hope or Law could have heard his softly whispered, "What's wrong?" Lena rubbed her lips against his. "I don't know." Puck, he just all of a sudden stopped. He was growling. I reached down to touch him and his hackles were all up. He doesn't act like that, Ezra. Ever. Actually, he sort of did. He stroked his thumb over her cheek and then slid his hands down to her shoulders, rubbing at them restlessly. That night at Law's. Remember how he acted? He didn't want to get out of the car. He kept staring into the trees. Like somebody was there, or had been, she murmured. She swallowed, her stomach crashing to her feet. And somebody had been there, long enough to leave a woman's lifeless body behind. This was worse, though, Ezra said.
Yeah.
Crouching down by Puck, she stroked a hand down his head, scratched him behind his ears. He whined low in his throat. Shh. It's okay, boy. It's okay. Maybe he saw him, or smelled him. Law's voice was a low, threatening snarl. Who? The same guy he smelled that night. She rose. Her hands were shaking, she realized. Sweaty and shaking. She was afraid. It fucking pissed her off. Law brushed past her. Reaching out, she caught his hand. Where are you going? Just want to take a look around. And look for what? And how will you manage to do it without looking conspicuous? Lowering his voice, Ezra said, if there's a chance he's here, and you go looking around, you're doing it with a big fat warning sign on your forehead. Be smart. Okay? The last thing Law wanted was to be smart. Lena knew him too well. But in the end, he relented. She had to wonder how much of that had to do with her and Hope, though.